where we sit here. We've been trying to put together a group to put a monument at that cemetery also. One of the more interesting stories of men who survived Elaine in the prison is the story of Albert Giles. And Albert Giles is an important story because not everybody that comes off of being on death row will have this wonderful life afterwards. Giles will go to Springfield, Illinois, open a speakeasy and gambling house, and will ultimately be killed in a gunfight. And he's buried in the same cemetery as Abraham Lincoln. Alfred Banks would go on to move out of Arkansas and make his way to Centerville, Illinois, where he's buried just outside in East St. Louis. And the oldest man ever placed on death row, a man by the name of Ed Coleman, was born a slave, protested with the sharecroppers, and was 75 years old when placed on death row. My students couldn't believe when they found his death certificate, that he'd fallen on the street, was rushed to the hospital, and that he was still laboring. And I know that this death certificate says 73, but at this time, he's believed to have been 79 years old. He was still working as a laborer when he collapsed on the street. The youngest of the men who were part of this union was the brother of Albert Giles, a man by the name of Milligan Giles. 15 years old, he joined the union and was charged with second-degree murder, which he could not have committed. He was paroled in 1923, and he was the only of the 122 sharecroppers that were imprisoned falsely, the only one to receive a pardon, and that pardon came in 1951. Understanding the relationship between Milligan Giles and his attorney, Scipio Jones, is very important because a lot of times when we hear Scipio Jones's name, we hear it attached to the Moore case and not so much to any of the smaller cases, any of the other people who weren't on death row. But the attorney will take pity on Milligan. And when Milligan comes up for parole, he will offer himself as the person who will work and be responsible for Milligan. Milligan works on his farm, and this spares him from getting work on a road crew or a labor crew or being leased out as a convict at the age of 15. I think it's important that we tell these stories, that we're able to connect these stories of the past with the present, that we're able to bring them into the classroom, and that we're able to celebrate them and commemorate them in our communities. I love what people are doing here. I love the pilgrims. I love that people are making these pilgrimages. I remember as a young man never hearing about internment camps. And then the president recognized the internments. And everything changed. I had the honor this year of going to the Brooklyn Book Festival after creating a graphic history. And one of the people who was on the panel with me at that book festival was a man by the name of Frank Abe. And Frank Abe had just completed a graphic history about internments. And his book looked at people who really weren't successful at their attempts to have freedoms and liberties. He looked at individuals, many of whom were arrested and imprisoned for refusing internment. I think it's important that we tell these difficult histories, and we tell them to our children, and that they know them and that they are taught in schools. And that's the way that we invoke change in society. Now, I know I spent a lot of time, I've got slides, but I want to pass the time on. I've been given a limited window. I want to make sure that my other speakers have enough time to complete their presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell. I won't come up in between each, but I want to make sure the slides work. I should have warned you that by going first, you were a bit of our tech guinea pig here. Okay, Dr. Johnson.
Good morning. And thank you so very much for allowing me to share this space with you. It truly is an honor to be among you, to share and connect our often difficult but very important histories in rural Arkansas. And so what I want to talk about for just a very few minutes is some of the work that I've done on African Americans and African American women's activism in rural Arkansas in particular. And this is from my most recent book, published in 2021, Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Black Women's Activism in Rural Arkansas Between 1914 and 1965. And of course, if you are in the Arkansas Delta, this is familiar to you. So many of the women I talk about in the book come from this part of the state. One woman came from Southwest Arkansas, but the vast majority of them lived and worked in the Arkansas Delta. When I talk about Black women's activism in Arkansas, these are some of the things that I talk about in the book. The Arkansas Agricultural Extension Service, home demonstration agents, farm agents, they were segregated until the 1960s. And as I tell people, although most of us understand them as folks who help people improve farm life, they work to improve farm life writ large. So what I mean is that while they may be teaching people how to farm better, farm agents, home demonstration agents, particularly in Black communities, were also helping these folks augment the quality of their lives, their access to political and economic opportunities. I also briefly mentioned the 1919 Elaine, Arkansas massacre, only to point out the fact that we don't talk about the involvement of rural Black women. So I'll speak to that very quickly as well. Women who are also members of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, women who were Jeans supervising industrial teachers. And finally, this is one of my favorite stories in the last chapter in my book. It's about a still living Black woman activist in rural Arkansas, Annie Zachary Pike. As a matter of fact, she called me just a few days ago. So in this image, I talk about a woman by the name of Mary L. Ray, and she was the first African-American home demonstration agent hired in Arkansas in 1918. Her husband, Harvey Cincinnatus Ray, was the first farm agent ever, African-American farm agent ever hired in this state. And one of the things that she and her husband did was they helped to form these home demonstration clubs. Now, home demonstration clubs aren't all that unusual at this time, but once again, they're segregated. And one of the things that I looked at in my research is what are they doing in these meetings? And as I've pointed out to people before, those who think about home demonstration clubs or who may have been members or have family members who may have been members, yes, they do things like canning tomatoes and corn and talk about agriculture and things like that, but the conversations are far more extensive than that. And as I've told people before, talking about canning tomatoes just ain't all that interesting. So I had to probe a bit deeper to find out what the other conversations were. And these are smart people. One of the things that I really emphasize in the research I do on rural people is that do not equate rurality with ignorance. Rural does not mean people are ignorant. In fact, I would argue it means that they're incredibly smart because they're often living in circumstances where they have no choice. This is just an image of assistant home demonstration agents in the 1950s. This also ended up being the cover of my book. And one of the most wonderful experiences I've had since the book came out is I gave a talk here in Little Rock, and a man and a woman came up to me and they said, "Oh, this woman is my mother." So one of the wonderful things about this is having people come up to me and say, "That's my mother, that's my aunt, that's my sister, whomever. Let me tell you what else she did in these rural communities." So their work went far beyond teaching people, again, about agricultural methods and the like. If you look at the records, and I spent a lot of time doing this, they talked about things like how to register to vote, which is a very novel thing to discuss in the rural Jim Crow South when you are an agricultural laborer at a time in a space where people would rather you not talk about voting, let alone attempting to actually exercise the right to vote. So it was really important for me to speak to their work beyond things that were related to agriculture. One of the other things I talk about is their roles during the 1927 Mississippi River flood. They work with the American Red Cross in camps, which were segregated, by the way, that were set up by the American Red Cross to help people get back on their feet, but also provide important educational access. Forth. And again, the point that I keep making, and I'm going to continue to make for as long as I do this research, is that we're talking about poor people, impoverished people, people who perhaps lack formal education, but we are not talking about unintelligent people. There is a difference. Again, when I talk about home demonstration clubs, they're segregated well up until the 1960s, as was the Arkansas Agricultural Extension Service. And this is just one example from Jefferson County, where Pine Bluff is located. And you can see very clearly here that it says a Negro Home Demonstration Club. But one of the things that I like to point out to people are all the roles that these women assumed as members of this club. So again, perhaps you are performing agricultural labor during the day, but in the evening you're the president of the home demonstration club, or you're the parliamentarian, or you're the treasurer. So all of these things require these women to have a pretty diverse skill set, and we don't think about that when we think about rural people. Once again, do not equate rurality with ignorance. In talking about the 1919 Elaine massacre, this is a copy of the Constitution and bylaws, and one of the things that I point out, and I've written an article about this, is when we talk about this story, we don't factor in women's roles. And so when people talk about James Miller, very few people are going to think to talk about Cleola Miller, who was also a member of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. And so I often show this to people when I give these talks. This is her, I suppose, membership card. And if you take a look at it, you see that she's very young. She's only 24 years old. She has 3 children. She's a member of this organization. And one of the things that really attracted my attention was when she was asked about the state of her health, she said that she was unhealthy, which was not uncommon for a rural woman, regardless of your racial background at the time, particularly if you come from a minoritized background. I also talk about the Southern Tenant Farmers Union founded in Tyronza in the mid-1930s. Again, we talk about this as an interracial enterprise, but we never talk about the complexities of all of that. And of course, we never really focus on women's roles. And so this is just one example with a woman named Eliza Nolden, who was a very active part of this organization, but she was later kidnapped and beaten because of her activism, and she had taken part in a cotton strike in 1935, and a group of planters kidnapped her and beat her, and she later died of her injuries. But before she died, she sued, right? She sued these folks who had harmed her. And I think this is important because, again, she dies of her injuries, but what we're missing here is the agency she exercised, number one, in her activism, number two, in suing the people who had physically harmed her. And there are many, many stories like this. I also talk about the Gene Supervising Industrial Teachers, and this was established by a Quaker woman from Philadelphia by the name of Anna Thomas Jeans. And in 1907, she left $1 million endowment to help support rural schools or Negro rural schools throughout the South. Virtually all of the Gene supervisors were African-American women. So just a little bit of information there about her. But if you think about what $1 million was worth in 1907, that's a considerable amount of money. And so, yes, so she established the Negro Rural School Fund. It was later renamed the Jeans Fund. And these women could be found throughout the South and throughout the Arkansas Delta. And this is just one example from Mississippi County, very close to where I live in Jonesboro, Annie Curry. And they do many of the same things that home demonstration agents do in rural communities. But again, there's what I like to call this sort of undercover activism, because they're talking about reading, writing, and arithmetic. Those things are incredibly important, but they're also talking about all these other ways to exercise agency and to improve conditions within African American communities, including being involved in things like the National Negro Health Movement founded by Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee Institute. And this lasts from 1915 until about 1950, but this was a way for local Black women activists to connect their efforts to a more national initiative to address the chronic health problems in rural Black communities. And if you were to look at Arkansas newspapers, you would see examples of this all throughout the newspaper, typically in the first week of April, where they're celebrating Negro Health Week or National Negro Health Week. And again, this was a collaborative between home demonstration agents, jeans supervisors, Black and white professional healthcare workers, all of these people coming together to help improve the health outcomes in rural Black communities. And I often tell people that improving these rural health outcomes includes birth control. So in 1942, the Planned Parenthood Federation of America established a Negro division. And if you can see this here at the very bottom, these are gene supervisors, African-American gene supervisors from Arkansas, writing to this organization saying, we need more of this information for our communities. And to be clear, they are asking for this information because the people in the community, the women in these communities want the information. So I always want to be clear that poor rural people have agency. They're not just acting on these people's behalf. These people are acting because they've been specifically asked to address these issues or to at least help them work collaboratively to address these issues. But sometimes this costs. Sometimes this activism costs. So it costs people like Island Upchurch, who was a gene supervisor, in Nevada County, Arkansas, South Arkansas. She's very much involved with the NAACP, which is an absolute no-no in 1950s America, particularly in the South. And even though the gene supervisor program lasts until 1968, it's shut down in 1950, most likely because of her affiliation with this organization. So this is just another example from the newspaper. She's very deeply involved with the NAACP, and she loses her job as a result. I'd like to end very quickly about Annie Zachary Pike. She is a politician, a farmer, a rural activist who's still very much alive today in Marvel, Arkansas, down in Phillips County. And she was born in Phillips County in 1930. She was born of farmers. Her parents were farmers. She ended up going to the White Consolidated River Academy for Negroes down in Brinkley, Arkansas, in Monroe County. And this was at a time when many African Americans, if they didn't feel like their children got the educational access that they needed and deserved, they supported co-educational African American boarding schools. And in fact, before Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, there were well over 100 of these co-educational African American operated boarding schools. So that's where she got her education. She comes back to Arkansas. She marries a significant African American landowner. As a matter of fact, he owns so much land in Phillips County, he has sharecroppers working for him. So it's not just about African Americans being sharecroppers, it's about African Americans who own land, who employ sharecroppers. Ms. Annie goes on to become politically active. She becomes involved with Winthrop Rockefeller when he's running for governor. And when he wins, he rewards her by making her the first African American to be appointed to a commission in since Reconstruction, really, when she ends up on the Arkansas Welfare Board. Not only does she end up in that position, she ends up also running for political office in Arkansas in 1972. She runs as a Republican, and she always makes it very clear that she was a Winthrop Rockefeller Republican. But she ends up running for state senate in 1972. And as you can see here from this flyer, she represents Lee and Phillips County. And if you take a look at this side in particular, you see all the things that this woman has been involved in. Community leader, 4-H, the Arkansas Association of Colored Women, the Farm Bureau, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. And then once, she doesn't win, by the way, but the vote is very, very close, which demonstrates what's possible as a rural Black woman in the Arkansas Delta. She goes on to participate or be appointed to a number of other committees. There's so many, we could be here all day talking about them, but one of them is she's appointed to the White House Conference on Aging. She's also the vice president of the Arkansas Minority Republican Organization. As a matter of fact, she remains an active part of the Arkansas Republican Party pretty much until the death of Winthrop Rockefeller, and then her participation in that of other African-American Republicans kind of wanes after that point. But all of this to say that when we're talking about these very difficult histories, we must forget, or we must not forget, that even within the difficulties, there's always agency. There's always self-empowerment. Just because people are knocked down doesn't mean that they're knocked out. And so when we look at these difficult histories of people from minoritized backgrounds, I don't think we ought to just focus on the oppression. I also think we need to focus just as much, if not more, on all the ways that people resisted that oppression. Thank you.
You can speak from there if you want.
Can we sit here?
You can stay there if you'd like.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Richard Yada, and I'm going to try to keep this as low key as possible. I don't have any slides because I'm not technology qualified. In fact, they were trying to explain to me what a QR code was this morning. So I'm going to sit right here and stay away from the computer. I'll start out by trying to tell you how life was growing up in Arkansas after the camps were closed. The first set the stage. My father was born in Hawaii, and my mother was born in California. Her parents were immigrant farmers, or migrant farmers. So they were having to move around California, and the kids weren't getting a very good education. So the parents sent them all back to, there's 4 of them, back to Japan to live with an aunt to get their education. And my father had been from Hawaii. He wanted to come to the mainland, so he had to quit school in the 8th grade to help. He was the oldest of 11 children, so he had to quit school early to help the family while working in the sugarcane fields. But he wanted to come to mainland he said he knew there was no future in cutting sugarcane all the rest of his life. So he wound up in California as a domestic worker, and he went to auto mechanic school. Then met my mother. It was an arranged marriage, and he was, I think, in his 30s. So just looking at their wedding picture the other day, neither one of them looked very happy with it. But he had a tux on, and she had a fancy wedding gown. So they had a big marriage apparently. So anyway, they were farmers in California when Pearl Harbor hit, and they given about a week and a half notice to get rid of everything they had and bring only what they could carry. So they had just bought a new car, so they had to sell that very cheap price and farm equipment and crops in the field. And at the same time, prior to Pearl Harbor, my father's sister, my aunt, she was a senior in high school, and she came over to help my mother. They had to feed the farm workers because the McDonald's and Wendy's weren't open yet. So they had to feed the farmers so they could eat and go back to work. So my aunt came over to help my mother feed the farmers at lunch, or the helpers at lunch. But then she told her father she's going to come over here and help for 1 year and then go back to Hawaii. Well, then Pearl Harbor hit. She couldn't go back. Then they were placed in Stockton, the Stockton temporary camp. And she graduated on the racetrack at the Stockton Fairgrounds. And then they were shipped to Rover. 4 days and 4 nights, just like George. It's supposed to be on a long vacation, and it turned out they didn't know where Arkansas was or how long they were going to stay. But when the camps were being built, the governor of Arkansas at the time told the federal government, okay, you can build the camps here in Arkansas, but as soon as the war is over, that all the Japanese have to leave the state. They cannot go to school in Arkansas. They cannot buy land in Arkansas. They must leave. And most of them with it. And our legislature actually passed that legislation and was signed by the governor. Now, the governor back then was a guy named Homer Atkins, and most people said he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So he was, race issue came into play there, but one school in Jacksonville still named after him. So, if we're going to tear down statues, that's one thing that needs to be changed at some point. But anyway, that's another story. So when the war was over, when the camps were closed, of course, everyone heard the message at the beginning. So all but about 7 or 8 families left. And I tell people that just how Arkansas would have changed if the doctors and the college professors and the lawyers, well, maybe not all lawyers, but some of the lawyers would have stayed and improved the economic system of Arkansas. When my parents got out of the camp, they moved to Scott, Arkansas, which is right across the river from Little Rock. And first farm they were going to before they came over, it was a family named Campbell, and they were going. About all the families were going to go farm there. But then the superintendent of the farm told the family that if you bring those Japanese over here, I'm quitting. So they said that we can't take them. But the lady named Virginia Brown, who was later married to Virginia, became Virginia Alexander, owned a lot of land in Scott, and she took them. So we moved to Scott and became sharecroppers, the 5 families or 6 families. And Miss Alexander was very outspoken, and she helped them market their products and grow their products and provided land and equipment to do that. And she also, another problem that came up was the school. Scott is in the Pulaski County school system. So when they started school, they said, okay, the school board says, back then there was a segregated school, a black school and a white school. And the difference in education was quite large because the funding for the school system, obviously the white schools got all the money, most of it. The African American, the black schools got some, but not as much as the white schools. So there was a big difference in the quality of education. So Miss Alexander goes to the board meeting and they said, okay, we got to decide where these Japanese are going to go to school. They're going to go to the white school or the black school. And she jumped up and said, they're going to the white school. So the board says, okay. And the meeting was over. So it was that one decision made a big difference in the quality of education that we received as we went to school. Now, I wasn't a typical brilliant Japanese student. The only problem I had, in most cases in the school system, in Scott, there's only 1 or 2 of us Japanese in each class. We were basically the teacher's pet. I remember we got caught in class one day with supposed to be at recess, and there were 4 of us, and 4 boys and 1 girl stayed in a room, And teacher called us in there and said, hey, you guys are supposed to be out. The other 3 boys got a spanking, and I didn't. So I said, hey, that must really be a teacher's pet. So, but in another case, when I was transferred to another school in the 7th grade, 8th grade, after the classes, about after 6 weeks after school started, so I was a little bit behind everybody. It was in Little Rock School District. And their quality of education was even higher than what it was in a rural school district. And I was making A's and B's at Scott, and I struggled to make C's and D's. The only problem I had at school was in the 8th grade, and that in an English class. Everything else was fine. But in the English class, but right after I got there, after they decided I wasn't the most brilliant person in class, had a spelling bee. And the teacher goes around, and finally, I was the last one standing. And she decided, well, something's wrong. He cannot win the spelling bee. So she had another one, said, let's do it again. And whoever we had this time gets to go to lunch first. So again, I won the second one. She gave up, so I went to lunch. But in the Scott system, there was no problem. We moved to Scott. The people were so kind, so nice, invited us to all the parties, invited us to all the church activities, and I was just grateful for the way they treated us. And I asked my dad, I said, why did you decide to stay in Arkansas and not go to California or even Hawaii, where he's from? And he said, well, I thought Arkansas would be a good place to raise children. And I believed that for a while, but I think he was getting reports from a lot of his friends who had gone back to California and were having problems finding jobs, finding a place to stay, and some of them were getting their houses shot at and not being treated as well as we were in Arkansas. So, I'll take it for what he said, that it was a good place to raise children. We had a good time. We got along with everybody, and still have some of the best friends we've ever had going back to the 1st grade. So, and as we worked as sharecrop farmers, all the families worked together and produced the crops, sell to the local produce stores and the grocery stores. Now, when they started working, everybody worked, even the women in the fields. I remember I was telling Aaron about my mother. We were planting onions, or she was planting. I was only 3 years old. So, you got to get on your hands. The last 2 remaining in Arkansas who were in the camp. So, well, I'm talking about my brother. If you'd got to remember him, he's having a little health issue with cancer right now. So, all prayers would be appreciated. But I got out of college and right just in time for Vietnam War. So I went into the Air Force and flying B-52s and had 59 combat missions and survived and finished my term and honorable discharge after 5 years. He came back to Arkansas, became a CPA and a certified financial planner, worked as a CPA for about 10 years, and then went to work for Merrill Lynch for 20 years, 35 years. And have 3 daughters, Kara, Kathy, and Kay. They were at the reunion at the Roar yesterday. And 5 grandchildren. And still love Arkansas, still appreciate the people of Arkansas for being so kind and good to our family and all the families. That's all I have.
Knowing Mr. Yada, this is a tough act to follow. What he didn't tell you is if you come to Central High School National Historic Site, you can see a picture of, we call them not Baby Yoda, but Baby Yada is in our exhibit. And it's been a pleasure to get to know him over the years working here in Little Rock. He's an amazing man. Let me just pause and say thank you for inviting us to speak today. On behalf of myself, I want to introduce my superintendent, Robin White, here in the front. If you'll just raise your hand. And so much of the work that I'll talk about briefly comes from her and from her vision and from her leadership. We were grateful, I think about 2 months ago, to have an opportunity to engage with some teachers here in Arkansas, with Roz and with the National Japanese American Historical Society, the Ninjas. And from that came a really good engagement to make sure these stories get into the schools in Arkansas. The only visual aid I usually take when we do programs at Central High School is my 11th grade history book. I was in high school in the mid-90s. And so not knowing there was an internet, not knowing that Al Gore, my senator in Tennessee, was going to invent it, I kept that history book thinking this is going to be my reference point. And in that history book are 3 sentences about the story that I interpret today about Little Rock Central High School. I can quote them to you. They're very vague and they're very one-sided. And so it's important that we as historians and to the ones who I succeeded here, that we talk about the past. I heard that word mentioned several times, and that we use the moments and the meanings and the memory to make sure that our youth today understand the relevance of these stories and that they are not as far in that rearview mirror as they may think. And so our story begins 65 years ago, not very far from here. When governors were mentioned earlier, another governor, in this case, Governor Orville Faubus, brings out the Arkansas National Guard at Central High School under the guise of protection. It's not protection. It's to prevent the change that the Supreme Court had mandated, that public schools should no longer be segregated. And in this moment, the governor's political decision being made, it impacts a community, but it impacts 10 children, not 9, 10 children. And these 10 children who had applied to come to Central High School, knowing that opportunity that Mr. Yada mentioned, knowing that the inequalities in the African-American schools, despite the fact they had incredible teachers, you can't do more with less. And they wanted this chance. And their opinion would not be if I get in, it's when I get in. Their resolve didn't waver over the 3 weeks that the National Guard is involved, when President Eisenhower gets involved and sees the governor's hand and raises it with the 101st Airborne. And so right in front of Central High School, if you come there today, if you walk up the stairs and you stand and look above its front entrance, there's 4 words underneath 4 statues that were put there over 95 years ago that are very ironic to this story. Those words are ambition, personality, opportunity, and preparation. If you think of those words and what they meant to those eventually 9 students, there was no give up. They never changed who they were. Even though they couldn't possibly be prepared for what they would face, they had a community at home, families who gave them unequivocal support And they took this opportunity that their families had never known and would not let it be taken out of their hands, despite the abuse, the violence, the torture, the domestic terrorism that they faced every day in a functioning high school. And they forever changed the community that we sit in today. We are really lucky with the National Park Service to get to tell this story every day to visitors from everywhere. I think we have figured we've met people from everywhere but maybe Antarctica, and if they were from there, they just didn't tell us. We go to people virtually from all over the world. This story knows no borders. It knows no language. It is wonderfully relevant to young people because it's a story of people. And the relationship that they find, that immediate connection, that immediate validation when they hear about what other young people did, cannot be understated. We're very lucky that we get to give programs and talk about these heroes behind us. We're very lucky that 8 of them are still with us today. We're very, very, very lucky that 2 of them live here in Little Rock. And we're very, very, very lucky that they continue to speak about it, that they continue to share their story so no one else can manipulate it, minimize it, or change its meaning. And so we as advocates, and we as our superintendent calls us agents of change, and all of you in this room are both of those things. It's so important that we speak, that our voices rise above the din that seems to occupy our space today in this country, that we share our past, that we connect it to our present, and that we use it as a roadmap for our future. Memory, I know I'm saying something everybody knows, memory is probably the most powerful teacher we have. It's a great reminder of where we've been and where we can return to if we're not careful. Let me just run through just a couple more images before I step down here. There's the aforementioned governor with President Eisenhower there. That's in Newport, Rhode Island, when they're trying to reach some kind of agreement and failed to do so. If you come to our site, you'll drive down a road named after this incredible woman who I think will have even more attention paid to her in the coming months. Her name is Daisy Gatson Bates. A statue of Mrs. Bates will be unveiled at some point in 2023 in the United States Capitol. She will represent this state with another Arkansan, Johnny Cash. And it's fitting that all eyes will turn to her in that rotunda as she looks across at another hero named Rosa Parks. The Little Rock 9 started the school year, and that full capacity is 9. And eventually it'll be down to 8. Let's see at the right of the photograph, holding her books, Minnie Jean Brown gets expelled during that school year. If you come to our site, you'll see some really emotionally powerful things, but you'll see something that's horrible. A card that's made after her dismissal that says 1 down, 8 to go. Minnie Jean will speak next week to some students that we've worked with. We've been so lucky to talk to 1,000 students during this academic year in the Pulaski County Special School District, where Mr. Yada cut his teeth. And these students will get to talk with her, and I can't tell you the excitement that these 1,000 4th graders have to speak to her. I think it's going to be unmatched. Here's images outside the school. When a second attempt fails in the absence of the military, the Little Rock police are called to arms, but they can't stop violence that tries to seek out the Little Rock 9 inside that building. The work we do every day at Central High School National Historic Site is not just based for visitors who come to us, whether we do programs that talk about this story on the grounds of the school or virtual programs. COVID has made us really, really efficient at those things. Or large special events. This was just a few months ago in September when we commemorated 65 years since this moment happened, and the street in front of Central High School no longer bears the name of South Park. It's now called, and forever will be called, Little Rock 9 Way. We're grateful to have 5 of them with us and to see the tears and the smiles, something that will never be forgotten. Again, we are lucky to get to go take this story to schools. We're lucky to have events like this. You see our superintendent leading that are communal programs that engage our community in song, in words, in poetry, in writing. We have cultural programs that engage all manner of this community. Community is a word that our superintendent speaks of on a daily basis. And it's so critical that we find a way not only to engage with the community, to listen to the community, to help be a microphone for the community. And especially coming out of COVID-19, it's important that we find and we share and we have conversations. We had a conversation in this room a few months ago about issues facing this community, that we work towards solutions, that we work towards social and emotional recovery in this community. We're very grateful that we have a connection with you and that we get to work with your story. I stand in front of a room full of heroes, and it is a true honor to get to be in your presence. Thank you for your voice. Thank you for your actions. Thank you for bringing your families here. And on behalf of the National Park Service and our superintendent, from all of us, thank you incredibly. We hope to see you this week. Let me pass it down so we can conclude. Thanks, Aaron.
Sio, Summer Wilkie Dawado, Jichalagi, Ayotli Awatesa. My name is Summer Wilkie, and I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation from Barron, Oklahoma. And it's my pleasure to be here speaking with you all today. I'll just echo my co-panelists in saying thank you for being here. Thank you for your strength and for your values that are expressed by coming and your courage and bringing your families to be here. Thank you to the organizers for the chance to come together and celebrate the important histories that are sometimes attempting to be erased or silenced in Arkansas. So I just thank you all. And it's my pleasure to be here and share a little bit about Indigenous history in Arkansas. Like I said, I'm from Oklahoma, but I've been in Fayetteville, Arkansas for around 9 years. I work at the university there, and I also am an alum of the University of Arkansas, about to be a two-time alum, working on a master's degree. A couple disclaimers I want to make before I get started too are that I'm not a historian. That's not my area of scholarship, but like probably a lot of people in the room could relate to, whenever your family's history, stories that you're taught about your history don't align with the history that you're taught in school. You become interested in history and you start to learn, and you know, if you're empowered to do so, maybe share a little bit about the history beyond what we're taught in the classroom. So that's where my interest in this topic comes from, is just my own experience, and there'll be bias in the way that I talk about these things. And from my perspective as a Cherokee person, the Cherokee people are not indigenous to Arkansas. And also, you know, I have some privilege compared to some of my indigenous relatives, just of being educated, because we're still continue to be underrepresented in higher education. So with that, I want to start with stating the fact that the present state of Arkansas is the traditional homeland of the Osage, Caddo, Quapaw, and Tunica people. And you know, they're still here. Their descendants are still here. Maybe not in Arkansas, but they're in Oklahoma, they're in Texas, where they've formed nations, and they're still thriving and governing their people and getting their young people educated, getting their stories told, you know. And so I'm not very qualified to represent their stories, but I'll try to talk a little bit about their experiences in Arkansas. And I want to start with one of the main obstacles to them remaining in Arkansas, which was the smallpox epidemic. Whenever Europeans came into Arkansas, they brought diseases that indigenous people had not encountered, and that had a huge impact on just the sheer number of indigenous people in Arkansas. Everett Bandy, who's the Quapaw Nation tribal historic preservation officer for the Quapaw Nation, he has a quote online in an article that he wrote that says, by 1750, the total Quapaw Nation is estimated to have been around 1,600. This equates to an estimated population loss of nearly 70% of the tribe in less than 100 years. So we cannot underestimate the impact of those diseases on what Europeans encountered and other peoples encountered as they came west. These populations had already been decimated by disease, and it wasn't just smallpox, and it wasn't just one epidemic. It was a series of epidemics, including measles and cholera. And so tribes like the Quapaw were greatly reduced. The Caddo also banded together and formed a confederation and moved west when they were forced west. The same thing was happening in the east to my people and other indigenous people in the east. And some Cherokee even moved into Arkansas before the forced removal known as the Trail of Tears. So some of you might have heard of Dwight Mission, which is not far from here on the Arkansas River, and that's one of the places where Cherokee people moved prior to removal to settle in Arkansas. I have a map here. This is kind of a Frankenstein map that I created myself, but I wanted to share with you all where I'm from, for one thing. This is 2020 census data of the density of Native American population in Oklahoma. And so where I grew up is the darkest blue county, Adair County in Oklahoma. And I'm right on the state line with Arkansas. It looks like there's a gap between the lines because I didn't do a good job making my map, but it's not, it's right there. And so that's where I grew up. And that's, you know, part of the reason why I ended up in Fayetteville. It's really only about 30 miles from my home. That's where my family was removed to during the Trail of Tears, which I'll talk about more in other removal routes of Cherokee people. But I especially wanted to show how the density of Native American population is kind of focused towards the east there, and also just highlight a few of these important places. The Dwight Mission that I mentioned eventually would be forced to relocate into what was known then as Indian Territory, further upstream on the Arkansas River. And then, it looks like whenever we converted slides, the rower title moved, but I just want to put that into context. Yeah, that I am coming from a kind of biased and more western side of the state. You know, you all know where this is all taking place on the Mississippi, but unfortunately, my perspective is more toward the state line. And so Oklahoma altogether has a 16% Native American population. Arkansas has about 1.1% population. So we know there were huge, sorry, I'm checking my time. I know I'm going to be going over. I'm going to try to hurry. Is it a big deal? Okay. So there were huge populations of Native American people in the Arkansas River Valley along the Mississippi. These were amazingly fertile places where they were having agriculture and building civilizations that rose and fell, and they were always a popular place to live. But for us to see now in comparison that 1.1 of the state population is indigenous, you know, I think that's important to draw attention to. So this is another, I wanted to just show also the population in Arkansas briefly. This is still from the 2020 census overlaid. So still that state line seems to be a place where the indigenous people of in Oklahoma are still concentrated. So I find that interesting, and that's where I'm from, like I said. So to talk briefly about the Trail of Tears and maybe why that is the case, I want to emphasize that there were multiple trails of tears. There were routes all over, weaving throughout Arkansas, especially along the Arkansas River. People came to what was known as Indian Territory at the time on trains, on boats. They came with enslaved people in some cases. They came, with wealth, or in some cases they came in a sense of being rounded up and imprisoned in an internment camp, in Georgia, and then forced at gunpoint, into Indian Territory. There's a lot of diversity in what the experience was of Indigenous people being moved across and out of Arkansas. So I really appreciate this map. This was created by the Trail of Tears Association for the, I think the state park association, or Arkansas State Parks. So, but that's where I found this map, and I appreciate that it shows just kind of the diversity of trails, and that it wasn't a single trail and removal. There were multiple trails and a lot of different kinds of experiences that people had with that. So that's where you can see it almost ends, in with where Fayetteville and Adair County kind of start, where I'm from. And so that's the story of my family too. And maybe part of why there are so many Native American people still in around that state line in the western part of Arkansas. Not long after that, you are all aware of the Civil War. Some of the Indigenous people who were had assimilated to an extent that they were supporting the South of the Civil War politically, and they were had enslaved people, and they which, by the way, there are a couple scholars who I want to mention, Dr. Taya Miles and Dr. Elena Roberts, who I'm inspired by, who have written a lot more on that subject. And so I know I'm not able to do that justice, but encourage you all to learn more about that if you find it interesting. And those people, some of that class of Indigenous people, they were in Fayetteville, and around Fayetteville, and they valued education highly, and they were educating their young people. They are maybe part of the reason why after the Civil War, whenever the Morrill Act was passed, the state got some money to build a land grant institution. Why that institution is in Fayetteville may be partly due to those Indigenous people and others who moved into that area and had a high value of higher education, and had already built the reputation of Fayetteville being known as a place where people could go to be educated. So it's an interesting history, complicated, but you all know Fayetteville is the home of the Razorbacks, the University of Arkansas, my alma mater, which I'm very proud of. But the legacy of the Morrill Act is, the profit that created the endowment for the university, and universities all over the U.S. was built based on stolen or coercively taken Indigenous land all over the United States. So that's part of where it connects to my role and what I'm trying to do at the university. And also my program that I'm a part of. So we're the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. We started by Dean Emeritus Stacy Leach, who was the first ever Native American dean of any law school at the University of Arkansas. And she and our other founding director, Janie Sims Hip, who is now the first Native American person ever to serve as general counsel for the USDA. So we're very proud of they said, we just had a conversation recently. We had our 10-year anniversary, and they said we were talking about the Morrill Act and the responsibility of land to Indigenous people before it was cool. And so they started this 10 years ago, and it's my pleasure to still be a part of this program. My role, as I shared, or as was shared in my introduction, but to remind you, is I'm the youth programming coordinator. So I get to host the Native Youth Food and Agriculture Leadership Summit each year at the University of Arkansas. And it's one way that our university works to be accountable to that responsibility to Indigenous people that without whose land the university would not have existed. And so we have a great time with that every summer. I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but another thing that's really close to my heart and why I stayed at the university is to support Indigenous students who attend the University of Arkansas. So these are some pictures of some of those activities. We have the Native American Student Association, which I am co-advisor to, and the picture up in the upper right-hand corner is us playing stickball. We've done a traditional stickball game a couple of times over the last couple years, and then we just hosted our first ever intertribal stickball tournament on campus. So we're having a lot of fun. I really am passionate about helping see Indigenous people succeed, be visible, and have success. I already said success, but just sense of belonging in higher education. So it's a pleasure to share that with you. One other quick project I should probably have skipped, but and I'm really not sure how much I can tell you about this, but the Health and Wellness Initiative for Native American Indian people in Arkansas is just a steering committee right now, but it's a project that I'm helping envision with a group of people from the American Indian Center of Arkansas. And some people may be in the room here. So they have community members from all over Arkansas who are interested in Indigenous health, and we're working to identify what some of the gaps are in that and improve outreach to that population in Arkansas. Because like for me, as I'm working at the university, I'm learning that although we're underrepresented in higher education across the board, students in Arkansas, Native American students in Arkansas, are not being reached and offered opportunities and acknowledged in the same way that Native American students in Oklahoma are, because of that history of it being a historical place that Indigenous people are. So it's kind of a new passion of mine, is to begin to improve that outreach and support for Native American young people in Arkansas. And even if it's just 1.1% of the population, they still matter, and they still, deserve to have the opportunities that everyone else does. So I think that's where I'm wrapping up. I guess I would like to just add another thank you, and that these histories are important, like everyone has said, and it's been my pleasure to share a little bit of my perspective, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. And thank you all for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. I want to just give one more big thank you round of applause to each of you. Thank you for starting us off today. Thank you for bearing with our technical, things happening. We are out of time, so we won't be able to have any Q&A, but I hope this has given me so much to think about, and it just the threads that emerged from this panel, from hearing from Duncan Williams the other night, there's so much to think about. So thank you so much. I'm hoping we could maybe get each of you to participate in Tadaima, which is a virtual community pilgrimage that's happening in October. So I'll follow up with that. But thank you so much. Thank you. I want to say one big thank you to the Central Arkansas Library System, who's hosting us here and who have a wonderful exhibit up. Heather Svenden, our dear friend, is here, of artwork from Rower and Jerome that you should go over and see if you have time during lunch. They've also gotten permission to keep the library open until 6 p.m. this evening if you'd like to go see the exhibit then. tomorrow, Saturday, 10 to 5. Heather is right here in the front. And she brought some books along. So if you've taken one, thank you so much. There are a few left. So we're trying to do sort of one per family, but please pick one up if you haven't, about that artwork and that exhibit. I want to send a huge thank you to Griffin, Joey, Deborah, the folks here at the Ron Robinson Theater, for making this work. And we have a day, the rest of the day left, so more to do. But I just want to say thank you. We have a short break before our next panel at 11:30. So thank you so much again.